My teacher called me a failure until the janitor pulled me aside and said something that made her face go red. Mrs. Duran slammed my chemistry test on the desk with the red F circled 3 times. The entire AP chemistry class turned to stare as she announced that some people just weren't meant for advanced science. She suggested I drop down to regular chemistry or maybe consider shop class instead. You're wasting everyone's time here. This is your 4th failed test. She tapped the paper with her red pen. Face reality. You're not college material. I stared at the periodic table poster behind her head, trying not to cry. The formulas and equations on my test were all correct, but she'd marked them wrong because I hadn't shown work her way. My phone sat in my backpack with the notification I'd been ignoring all morning. Another offer from a tech company about my app. After class, I stayed behind to clean up the lab equipment like always. It was my punishment for failing, but I actually liked the quiet time to think. Mr. Castillo, the janitor, came in with his cart and started mopping around the lab tables. He'd been watching me work for weeks now. Why do you stay after every day? Detention? He asked while squeezing out his mop. I explained about the failed tests and Mrs. Duran's new policy, how I had to clean labs to earn extra credit just to pass, how she said I'd never amount to anything in science. Mr. Castillo stopped mopping and really looked at me for the first time. Not the quick glance adults usually gave students, but actually seeing me. His eyes went to my backpack where my laptop was sticking out, the one with stickers from hackathons and coding competitions. Is that yours? He pointed at the laptop. I nodded and explained I did some programming on the side. Nothing special, just apps and websites for fun. He asked to see what I was working on, so I pulled out my laptop and showed him my latest project, a tutoring app that matched students with peer helpers based on learning styles. His eyes widened as I demonstrated the algorithm, how it analyzed user data to create perfect matches, the payment system I'd integrated, the scheduling features that synced with school calendars. I'd been testing it with a few hundred users, and the retention rates were incredible. How many users did you say? His voice had changed completely. About 3,000 now, growing by 200 each week. I minimized the dashboard before he could see the revenue numbers, but Mr. Castillo was faster than he looked. He'd already spotted the monthly recurring revenue at the bottom of the screen. His mop handle clattered to the floor. He grabbed a chair and sat down hard, staring at my laptop screen like it might disappear. You're making $40,000 a month? He whispered. I tried to explain it wasn't that simple. Server costs and payment processing fees ate up a chunk. Marketing expenses were growing. I'd hired 2 freelance developers to help with updates. But yeah, the profit margins were still pretty solid for a side project. Side project? He laughed, but not in a mean way. Kid, I worked in Silicon Valley for 10 years before my wife got sick. Before I had to move here for her treatment. I know what I'm looking at. He asked more questions about my user acquisition strategy and churn rates. Used terms I'd only heard on startup podcasts. This wasn't some janitor making small talk. This was someone who understood exactly what I'd built and what it could become. Mrs. Duran walked back in carrying her coffee and froze in the doorway. She saw Mr. Castillo at my laptop and immediately started yelling about unauthorized computer use, about how I was probably cheating on assignments, about how this proved I didn't belong in advanced classes. Ma'am, do you know what your student built? Mr. Castillo stood up slowly. I don't care what games he plays on that computer. She set down her coffee with a dismissive wave. It's not a game. It's a functioning edtech platform with 3,000 paying users generating $500,000 in annual recurring revenue. His voice was perfectly calm. I've seen Stanford MBAs pitch worse ideas for millions in funding. Mrs. Duran's face went through several expressions. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something like fear as she processed what those numbers meant. A 17-year-old she'd been failing was quietly out-earning her salary by multiples. That's not possible, but her voice wavered. I opened my striped dashboard and turned the laptop toward her. The numbers were right there. Daily transactions, monthly growth charts, user testimonials from students saying the app had saved their grades. Everything she said I couldn't do while I was actually doing it. You could be making millions if you scale this properly. Mr. Castillo looked at me seriously. Have you talked to any investors? Mrs. Duran's face went white. Actually white like all the blood had drained away. She looked between us several times before grabbing her coffee and walking out without another word. We could hear her heels clicking faster and faster down the hallway. Mr. Castillo pulled out his phone and started scrolling through contacts. Said he still knew some people from his startup days. People who'd want to see what I'd built. One thing, though. He looked at me seriously. Don't drop this class. Let her fail you if she wants. We're gonna bring her hell. Mr. Castillo pulled his phone from his pocket and started typing with his thumbs moving fast across the screen. He explained while he typed that his old colleague Vikram had invested in 3 different education technology companies that all went on to successful exits. Vikram would definitely want to see what I'd built, because this was exactly the kind of thing he looked for. I watched Mr. Castillo's fingers move and felt my hands still shaking a little from the confrontation with Mrs. Duran, but something else was building underneath the nerves. Maybe I didn't have to just accept being treated like I was stupid. Maybe there was another way to handle this. Mr. Castillo hit send and looked up at me with this serious expression. He said Vikram would probably want to do a call this week, and I should be ready to show real numbers, not just talk about how the app helped students. I nodded and grabbed my backpack off the lab table. The empty lab felt different now, like something had shifted in the last 20 minutes that I couldn't quite name yet. That night I sat at my desk in my bedroom staring at the laptop screen showing my email inbox. The latest acquisition offer sat there with the subject line that said, "Acquisition Interest," followed by the company name. I opened it and saw they were offering $850,000 for my app, with the full terms attached in a PDF. The number should have excited me, but I couldn't focus on it. My brain kept replaying Mrs. Duran's face when she saw my revenue dashboard. That mix of shock and fear when she realized a 17-year-old she'd been failing was quietly making more money than her by a lot. She knew exactly what those numbers meant for her authority in that classroom. I scrolled down through the acquisition offer reading about transition periods and earn-out clauses, but none of it stuck in my head. Something about Mr. Castillo's plan felt more important than taking a quick payout and walking away. I moved my mouse to close the email without responding and went to bed still thinking about that look on her face. The next morning, I walked through the hallway before first period and noticed people staring at me more than usual. Groups of students would look over and then turn back to whisper to each other. I caught pieces of conversations as I passed, talking about Mrs. Duran and the chemistry lab and something about yesterday afternoon. Apparently someone had seen her leave the lab looking really upset, and now rumors were spreading through school. Some people thought I'd threatened her. Others were saying I got caught with something illegal on my laptop. My friend group found me at my locker and immediately started asking what happened. I just shook my head and said it was a misunderstanding about extra credit work. They kept pushing for details, but I wasn't ready to explain the whole situation yet. How do you tell people that your teacher saw you're making $40,000 a month and completely lost it? I grabbed my books and headed to first period, while more students stared and whispered. During lunch, I skipped the cafeteria completely and headed back to the chemistry lab for my daily cleaning duty. Mrs. Duran had a different lunch period, so the lab was empty and quiet. I found the familiar routine of organizing beakers and wiping down lab stations oddly calming after the morning of stares and whispers. My hands moved through the motions of sorting equipment by size and checking that all the gas valves were properly closed. This punishment that was supposed to humiliate me had actually become my favorite part of the day. The quiet space let me think without all the chaos of the cafeteria. I mentally planned out some app updates I wanted to push next week and ran through my business numbers in my head. Server costs were stable. User growth was steady. The 2 freelance developers I'd hired were handling the bug fixes. Everything was running smoothly despite the mess at the school. Mr. Castillo found me in the lab about halfway through lunch period and said Vikram could do a video call tomorrow evening if I was available. He warned me while leaning against one of the lab tables that Vikram would ask really tough questions about user acquisition costs and churn rate and competitive advantages. I needed to prepare actual data, not just feel-good stories about helping students. Vikram would want to see the real metrics that showed whether this was a sustainable business or just a lucky streak. I told Mr. Castillo I could do tomorrow evening, and he nodded. I spent my free period that afternoon in the library pulling together a rough metrics deck on my laptop. I created slides showing monthly user growth trends and average revenue per user and retention curves. This felt way more intense than the casual pitch meetings I'd done before with the companies that wanted to buy my app. Those had been friendly conversations. This sounded like Vikram was going to pick apart every assumption I'd made. In AP Chemistry that afternoon, Mrs. Duran avoided making eye contact with me the entire class. I sat in my usual seat in the 3rd row, and she looked everywhere else when she talked. Even when I raised my hand to answer a question about balancing equations, she called on someone else. She announced near the end of class that we'd have a quiz on Friday covering equilibrium equations. Several students groaned because her quizzes were known for being tricky with partial credit only awarded if you showed your work exactly her way. I took detailed notes on everything she wrote on the board, knowing I'd need to prove I understood the material using her specific format. My pencil moved across the paper, copying down each step of her example problems with the notation she preferred. I couldn't give her any excuse to mark me down this time. After school, I stayed late in the computer lab working on my metrics presentation for Vikram. I was deep into formatting a slide about user acquisition channels when Tiana King stopped by on her way out from yearbook committee. She walked over to my table and mentioned she'd been using my tutoring app for calculus help. Her tutor actually explained things in ways that made sense, unlike her teacher who just wrote formulas on the board. I looked up from my laptop and asked if she'd be willing to give me feedback on some new features I was testing. She immediately agreed and said she'd love to help improve something that had already helped her so much. We exchanged contact info, and she said to just send her a message when I had stuff ready to test. Having actual users who appreciated the app reminded me why I'd built it in the first place. That evening, I practiced my pitch for Vikram using my laptop camera recording myself. I tried to sound confident but not cocky about what I'd built. My talking points covered user growth trends and the matching algorithm's success rate and average session ratings. I explained the monthly recurring revenue and realistic projections for scaling if I had more resources. When I watched myself back on the video, I looked and sounded way more professional than I felt inside, like I was playing the role of a startup founder rather than actually being one. I recorded 3 more practice runs, trying to sound more natural and less rehearsed. By the 4th take, I was getting better at just explaining things clearly without overthinking every word. The video call with Vikram happened the next evening in my bedroom, with my laptop propped up on my desk. He appeared on screen and looked exactly as intense as Mr. Castillo had warned. Vikram pulled apart my user acquisition strategy right away, asking how much each channel cost and what the conversion rates were. He questioned my customer lifetime value calculations and pointed out that my profit margins would get squeezed significantly if I had to hire real employees instead of freelancers. Every time I answered one question, he had 3 more ready. He wanted to know about competitive threats and why students wouldn't just use free alternatives. What made my matching algorithm actually better than random assignment? Why I thought I could scale this without it falling apart. But after an hour of tough questions, he said the core product was solid and the market timing was good. He wanted to introduce me to 2 other people who might be interested in investing or advising. The call ended, and I sat there feeling exhausted, but also validated. Vikram had taken me seriously as a real business, not just a kid's hobby project. Friday morning, I walked into AP Chemistry and took Mrs. Duran's equilibrium quiz. I deliberately showed every single step of my work, using exactly the format she'd demonstrated in class earlier that week. Each problem got broken down with clear labels for the initial conditions and the equilibrium expression and the ICE table and the final calculation. It felt slow and inefficient compared to how I naturally solved problems, but I forced myself to follow her system precisely. The problems themselves were straightforward, and I knew this material cold. The real test was whether I could stop solving things my own way and prove I understood her approach. I finished with time to spare and used the extra minutes to review every line, making sure my notation matched her examples. Walking out of class, I felt cautiously hopeful that maybe this time she wouldn't have an excuse to mark me down. The weekend stretched ahead, and I had investor emails to respond to and app updates to review, but for now, I just wanted to believe I'd done enough to pass her test. During lunch that same Friday, I sat in the cafeteria with my laptop open and drafted an email to Joyce Hendricks. I kept my tone professional and focused on specific examples rather than just complaining about unfair treatment. I attached scans of 3 previous chemistry tests where my answers arrived at correct solutions, but got marked wrong because I used different methods than Mrs. Duran demonstrated in class. Each attachment had my work circled in red, with her comments about improper format or missing steps, even though the final answers matched the textbook solutions exactly. I explained that I believed the grading was inconsistent and based on methodology preferences rather than actual understanding of the material. Before hitting send, I added Mr. Castillo to the CC line as a witness to our previous conversation about my app and the confrontation with Mrs. Duran. My finger hovered over the send button for a solid minute while I reread everything twice, checking for any hint of disrespect or accusation that could backfire. Finally, I clicked send and closed my laptop, feeling my heart beat faster. 2 hours later, during my free period, I checked my email and found a response from Joyce already waiting. She asked me to come to her office Monday after school and said she was requesting that Mrs. Duran also attend to discuss the grading concerns. The email was professionally neutral, but the speed of her response and the fact she was bringing Mrs. Duran in made it clear she was taking this seriously. I forwarded the email to Mr. Castillo with a quick thanks for supporting me. That evening, while I was working on app updates, my phone buzzed with a text from him saying he was proud of me for using the proper channels instead of just complaining to friends or giving up. He offered to attend the Monday meeting as a faculty advocate if I wanted someone there besides just me and Mrs. Duran and Joyce. Saturday morning, I started building a comparison document that showed my work side by side with the textbook approach for each disputed problem. I pulled out all my old chemistry tests and carefully photographed each page, then organized them in a shared document with annotations explaining my reasoning. For each problem, I wrote out both my solution method and the standard textbook method, showing how they arrived at the same answer through different paths. The work took most of the day because I wanted everything crystal clear and impossible to argue with. Sunday evening, I met Mr. Castillo at a coffee shop near school, and we practiced how I would present my case without sounding defensive or like I was attacking Mrs. Duran personally. He coached me to frame everything as requesting clearer rubrics and acceptance of multiple valid solution methods rather than demanding my grades be changed or saying she was wrong to fail me. He pointed out that administrators care more about policy improvements that help all students than about individual grade disputes. We role-played the meeting with him asking tough questions about why I thought my methods were acceptable and whether I had tried to follow her format before complaining. By the end, I felt more confident about staying calm and professional, even if Mrs. Duran got defensive or Joyce asked hard questions. Sunday night around 11, I opened my email to find a message from Vikram asking for detailed financial breakdowns of my app business. He wanted server costs broken out by provider and usage tier, payment processing fees calculated as both flat amounts and percentages, developer expenses itemized by project with hourly rates, customer acquisition costs separated by channel, showing how much I spent on each marketing method and how many users came from each source. The level of detail he requested made me realize how informal my bookkeeping had been up to this point. I tracked revenue obsessively because seeing the numbers grow was exciting, but my expenses were scattered across 3 different credit cards and 2 bank accounts with no organized system. I opened a spreadsheet and started pulling transaction histories from every account, trying to categorize each expense properly. Server costs were easy because I had monthly bills from the same providers. Developer payments were mostly straightforward because I used the same freelance platform. But marketing expenses were a mess of small transactions for Facebook ads and Google ads and Instagram promotions that I had to dig through individually. By 1 in the morning, I had a rough P&L statement that showed my actual profit margins were thinner than I thought once I accounted for everything properly. The $40,000 in monthly revenue looked impressive, but after subtracting $12,000 for servers, and $8,000 for developers, and $6,000 for marketing, and another $3,000 for payment processing fees, and random other costs, I was actually netting closer to $11,000 per month. Still good money for a high school side project, but not the massive success the gross revenue number suggested. I sent the spreadsheet to Vikram at 2 in the morning, then collapsed into bed. Monday morning, my alarm went off at 6, and I felt like I had been hit by a truck. 3 hours of sleep after a weekend of stress and preparation left me barely functional. During first period English, I kept nodding off while my teacher discussed symbolism in some novel we were reading. She stopped mid-sentence and asked if I was feeling okay. I mumbled something about staying up late working on a project, and she gave me a concerned look, but moved on. Sitting there fighting to keep my eyes open, I realized I was trying to do too many things at once, and something had to give. Running a growing business that generated real revenue and fighting academic battles with teachers and maintaining good grades in all my other classes was not sustainable. The investor diligence and the school meeting happening on the same day felt like the universe forcing me to choose priorities, but I was not ready to give up on either path yet. At lunch, I pulled out my phone and drafted an email to Vikram asking if we could push our next scheduled call from Monday evening to Wednesday evening. I explained I had an important school meeting Monday afternoon that I needed to prepare for properly, and I wanted to give both things my full attention rather than rushing through one to get to the other. I hit send expecting him to be annoyed about the delay, but his response came back within minutes. He said Wednesday worked fine and added that seeing me prioritize school commitments actually increased his confidence in my judgment and maturity. Most founders he worked with were so obsessed with their startups, they let everything else fall apart, which usually led to bad decisions from exhaustion and tunnel vision. The response made me feel better about the choice, like maybe protecting my academic standing was not just defensive, but actually strategic for long-term credibility. An investor who respected that I took school seriously was probably an investor worth working with. Monday afternoon at 3:30, I walked into Joyce Hendrick's office and found her sitting behind her desk with Mrs. Duran already seated in one of the chairs facing her. Mr. Castillo arrived a minute later and took the seat next to me. Joyce thanked everyone for coming and explained she wanted to discuss the grading concerns I had raised to see if we could find a resolution that worked for everyone. Mrs. Duran immediately jumped in, defending her rubric as necessary for AP exam preparation. She said the College Board expected students to show specific types of work and use standard notation, so she had to enforce those requirements strictly to prepare students for the actual test. I waited for her to finish, then calmly pulled out my comparison documents and walked through 3 examples where I had correct answers marked wrong. I showed how my methods were mathematically valid and arrived at the same solutions as the textbook approaches, just using different intermediate steps. Joyce asked detailed questions about whether the AP exam actually required one specific methodology or just correct answers with clear reasoning. Mrs. Duran admitted the exam did not mandate one particular method, but insisted students needed consistency to avoid confusion, especially weaker students who might get lost trying to learn multiple approaches. The discussion went back and forth for nearly an hour, with me staying calm and focused on the documentation, while Mrs. Duran got increasingly defensive about her teaching methods. Finally, Joyce held up her hand and proposed a compromise. I could complete a multi-part demonstration assessment that would show I understood the material using both Mrs. Duran's preferred methods and alternative approaches. If I could prove genuine understanding through multiple formats, then my grade should reflect that competency rather than just methodology compliance. The compromise meant 3 separate assessments over the next 2 weeks. First, an oral explanation, where I would walk through my problem-solving process out loud, answering questions about my reasoning. Second, a timed written test using Mrs. Duran's exact format with every step labeled and notated exactly as she demonstrated in class. Third, a lab practical, where I would demonstrate applied understanding by actually conducting experiments and analyzing results in real time. If I passed all 3 components, Joyce would recalculate my grade to reflect actual competency rather than format compliance. It was definitely more work than just retaking one test, but it also felt fairer than being forced to abandon approaches that worked for how my brain processed problems. Mrs. Duran agreed to the plan, but her expression made it clear she was not happy about it. Mr. Castillo gave me an approving nod as we left the office. By Tuesday morning, the rumor mill had apparently decided I was either a genius entrepreneur or running some kind of scam. I heard whispers in the hallways about how much money I was supposedly making with wild speculation, ranging from a few thousand to millions. During passing period between 2nd and 3rd period, someone showed me a post on the school's anonymous gossip app, claiming I had paid someone else to build my app and was just taking credit for their work. The accusation stung badly, because I had written every single line of the original code myself, spending hundreds of hours learning frameworks and debugging problems and iterating on features. Tiana found me between 3rd and 4th period, looking stressed, and told me she had already posted a response on the app, explaining that she used my tutoring service, and it was completely legitimate and helpful. She said several other students had backed her up in the comments, but I could tell from her tone that the social credibility damage was already done. People love drama more than truth, and a scandal about a student entrepreneur cheating was way more interesting than a boring story about someone who actually built something useful. That evening around 7, my phone buzzed with an Instagram DM from Tiana. She said she was willing to publicly vouch for my app and explain in detail how it helped her if that would counter the cheating accusations. She mentioned that several of her friends also used the platform regularly, and they were all happy to speak up about how it was a legitimate tutoring service that matched them with peer helpers, not some way to cheat on assignments or buy test answers. I appreciated her offer and told her I was grateful she had my back, but asked her to hold off on any public statements for now. The last thing I wanted was to drag other students into drama with teachers who might retaliate against anyone defending me. Mrs. Duran already had it out for me, and I did not want her taking shots at Tiana or anyone else just because they supported my business. Tiana sent back a thumbs-up emoji and said she understood, but the offer stood if I changed my mind. Wednesday evening, I sat at my desk with my laptop open, waiting for Vikram's video call to start at 7. My P&L spreadsheet was pulled up on one monitor and my user dashboard on the other. The call connected, and Vikram appeared on screen wearing a casual button-down shirt and sitting in what looked like a home office. He got straight to business, asking me to share my screen and show him the P&L breakdown. I walked him through each line item, starting with revenue, and he immediately stopped me to ask about my revenue recognition policy and whether I was booking monthly subscriptions up front or recognizing them over time. I had to admit, I had been just tracking cash as it came in without thinking about proper accounting rules. He spent the next 20 minutes explaining accrual accounting and why it mattered for understanding my actual financial health. Then he moved to expenses and questioned every single category. Why was I spending so much on marketing when word of mouth seemed to be driving most growth? How much were my server costs per user, and was that sustainable as I scaled? What were my freelance developers actually building, and could I justify their hourly rates? He wanted to see detailed metrics on user cohorts, showing how students who signed up in different months behaved differently. He asked about retention curves and what percentage of users were still active after 1 month, 3 months, 6 months. He wanted a breakdown of which marketing channels actually drove quality users who stuck around versus users who signed up and never came back. I scrambled to pull data from different places trying to answer his questions, but kept running into gaps in my tracking. The conversation was exhausting because he would not accept vague answers or estimates. He wanted specific numbers, and when I did not have them, he explained why those metrics mattered and what I should be measuring. By the time we finished 2 hours later, my head hurt, but I had filled 3 pages of notes about what data I needed to start tracking properly. Vikram said my business fundamentals looked solid, but my data infrastructure was way too informal for someone thinking about raising money or scaling seriously. He was basically giving me a free crash course in startup finance and the metrics that actually mattered to investors. I thanked him for his time and promised to clean up my tracking systems before our next call. Thursday morning, I woke up to an email from someone named Foster McPherson in the district IT department. The subject line read, "Privacy compliance concerns regarding student application," and my stomach dropped before I even opened it. Foster explained that the district had become aware of my tutoring app and had some concerns about privacy and data collection since it served students under 18 and operated partly on the school networks. He cited something called FERPA, which apparently regulated educational records, and COPPA, which had rules about collecting data from minors. He said the district needed to review my privacy practices and compliance measures before deciding whether to continue allowing access to my site on the school networks. He requested a meeting next week to discuss the specific requirements I would need to meet. The email was professional and not threatening, but the implications sent me into a panic. Losing school network access would kill a huge chunk of my user base overnight. Students accessed my app during study halls and free periods when they needed help with homework. If the district blocked my site, it would also signal to students and parents that the app was somehow dangerous or inappropriate, even if that was not true. I spent my first period class barely paying attention while mentally calculating how many users I would lose if schools blocked access. The number was probably close to 40% based on my traffic patterns. That would cut my revenue by $15,000 a month minimum. I emailed Foster back during lunch, saying I was available to meet whenever worked for him, and asked if he could share more details about what specific compliance requirements I needed to address. He responded an hour later with a meeting time for next Wednesday and attached a PDF about FERPA and COPPA regulations that was 30 pages long. I spent my free period that afternoon trying to read through the legal document, but most of it was written in complicated language I could barely understand. That night around 11, I was working on some app updates when my phone started buzzing with support tickets. Users were reporting error messages when they tried to log in. I pulled up my monitoring dashboard and saw my server response times had spiked to several seconds. Within minutes, the app went completely down, showing a connection timeout error. My heart started racing as I checked my server logs and realized traffic had jumped way higher than normal. Some viral post somewhere must have driven a huge spike of new users trying to sign up all at once. My current server setup could not handle the load, and everything had crashed. I spent the next 2 hours troubleshooting and trying to get things stable again. First, I had to restart the application servers, which took forever because they were completely frozen. Then I had to scale up my database capacity, because that was the main bottleneck. I upgraded to a bigger server instance and added more memory, which cost extra, but was necessary to handle the traffic. By 1 in the morning, I finally got everything running smoothly again, and traffic was flowing normally. I sent out an apology on my status page explaining there had been a brief outage due to unexpected traffic, but everything was fixed now. Then I sat back and looked at the costs. The server upgrades had added another $400 to my monthly expenses. The incident was a harsh reminder that my technical setup could not be an afterthought anymore. I needed proper monitoring that would alert me before things crashed and automatic scaling that would add capacity when traffic spiked instead of just falling over. I also needed better load testing to understand my breaking points before users found them for me. A longer outage would have damaged my reputation with users who depended on the app for homework help. I made notes about infrastructure improvements I needed to make, then stumbled to bed. I woke up at 3 in the morning, still sitting at my desk with keyboard marks pressed into my face. Friday after school, I headed to the chemistry lab for my usual cleanup duty and found Mr. Castillo already there organizing supplies. He said he wanted to help me prepare for Monday's oral assessment by playing the role of a tough examiner. We spent the next hour going through equilibrium problems from my textbook. He would read a problem, and I would start solving it out loud, explaining each step. Then he would interrupt with pointed questions about why I chose that particular approach, and how I would explain my reasoning to someone who learned the material differently. At first, I got defensive, trying to prove my method was better, but he kept pushing back, asking me to consider the perspective of a student who found my shortcuts confusing. He made me walk through the same problems using the standard textbook format, showing all the intermediate steps I normally skipped. It felt slow and tedious, but I started to see how someone without my intuition might need those extra steps to follow the logic. His coaching helped me realize the oral assessment was not about defending my preferred method as superior. It was about demonstrating I understood the material well enough to explain it multiple ways, depending on what a student needed. By the end of the session, I felt more confident about Monday. Mr. Castillo reminded me to stay patient, even if Mrs. Duran tried to rattle me with nitpicky questions. The goal was to prove I knew the chemistry, not to win an argument about teaching methods. The following Monday in AP Chemistry, Mrs. Duran assigned lab partners for an experiment about reaction rates. After we finished, she made a big show of pointing out that some students had left their stations messy. She walked around inspecting each area and stopping at my table even though I had cleaned everything properly. Then she announced loudly that I would stay after to clean up not just my station, but also the stations of several other students who had actually made the messes. She added a comment about how students who question authority need to prove their commitment to the class through extra effort. Everyone turned to stare at me and a few people smirked. I felt my face getting hot, but bit my tongue and just nodded. After class ended, I started gathering dirty beakers and wiping down the other lab tables while my classmates filed out. The work was not hard, but the public humiliation stung. Mrs. Duran sat at her desk, grading papers and occasionally glancing up to make sure I was working. About 20 minutes into the cleanup, Mr. Castillo walked past the open classroom door with his cleaning cart. He paused and looked in, seeing me scrubbing lab tables while Mrs. Duran watched. His expression shifted to something like disapproval, and he shook his head slightly before continuing down the hallway. The small gesture of solidarity made me feel less alone, even though he did not say anything. Tuesday afternoon, I showed up to Mrs. Duran's classroom after school for the first part of my demonstration assessment. Joyce Hendricks was already there, sitting in a student desk near the back with a notepad. Mrs. Duran had prepared 5 equilibrium problems written on the whiteboard, ranging from simple to complex. She told me to work through each one out loud, explaining my reasoning step by step and showing how I could solve them using both the standard textbook approach and alternative methods that achieved the same result. I started with the first problem, which involved calculating equilibrium concentrations from initial conditions and an equilibrium constant. I walked through the standard ICE table method, labeling initial concentrations, changes, and equilibrium values. Then I showed how you could also set up the same problem using a system of equations if you understood the underlying algebra. Mrs. Duran interrupted, asking why I had written the equilibrium expression a certain way and whether my notation was standard. I explained my notation matched the textbook, but I could write it differently if that was clearer. She asked several more questions about terminology and whether I was using proper significant figures. I stayed patient and answered everything carefully. Joyce took notes and occasionally asked her own clarifying questions about how I had learned these alternative approaches and whether I understood when each method was most useful. The second and third problems went similarly, with me demonstrating multiple solution paths and Mrs. Duran finding small things to question. By the fourth problem, which involved a complex multi-step equilibrium, I could tell Joyce was satisfied I knew the material. She asked me to explain how I would teach this concept to another student who was struggling, and I walked through how I would break it down into smaller pieces. The fifth problem was the hardest, involving temperature effects on equilibrium, and I had to really think through my explanation. But I managed to show both the thermodynamic approach using Le Chatelier's principle and the mathematical approach using the Van't Hoff equation. By the end of the hour session, I felt like I had proven my understanding, even if Mrs. Duran would not admit it. Joyce thanked me for my time and said she would review her notes with the administration. Wednesday afternoon, I met Foster McPherson in the district office downtown. His office was small and cluttered with computer equipment and binders of policy documents. Foster turned out to be surprisingly reasonable, and not at all the bureaucrat I had worried about. He explained that because my app served students under 18, and operated partly on the school networks, the district had a responsibility to make sure it met privacy regulations. He walked me through FERPA, which protected student educational records, and COPPA, which required parental consent for collecting personal information from anyone under 13. Since my app had users as young as 14, I needed to get explicit parental consent before collecting any data. I also needed a clear privacy policy explaining what information I collected, how I used it, and who had access to it. Foster said I should consider an external security audit to verify my data protection practices met industry standards. The requirements were not impossible, but they would take serious time and possibly money to implement properly. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. He gave me a 30-day deadline to get everything compliant, or the district would block access to my site on the school networks. I asked what specifically I needed to do, and he pulled out a checklist. Parental consent system for all users under 18. Privacy policy written in clear language, not legal jargon. Data encryption for sensitive information. Regular security updates and patches. Documentation of my data handling practices. Possibly an external audit depending on what the district's legal counsel decided. Foster said he actually wanted to support student innovation and was not trying to shut me down. He just needed to make sure I was protecting student privacy properly. I thanked him for being reasonable and promised to start working on compliance immediately. Walking out of the district office, I felt overwhelmed by everything I needed to do, but also relieved that Foster seemed willing to work with me instead of just blocking my app. Thursday evening, I met Vikram in person for the first time at a coffee shop downtown near the business district. He was younger than I expected. Maybe late 30s, with dark hair and wearing jeans and a plain t-shirt under a casual jacket. He carried a beat-up laptop covered in startup stickers and ordered a black coffee before we sat down at a corner table. For the next 2 hours, he grilled me about my long-term vision for the app. Did I want to build a real company, or was this just a side project until college? What were the biggest competitive threats, and how would I defend against them? What would happen if one of the big education technology companies launched a similar feature? He asked tough questions about user retention and whether students would stick with my app once they graduated or moved to different schools. His hardest question came about an hour in, when he asked what would happen to my users if I sold to one of the companies that had made acquisition offers. Would the new owners keep running the platform the same way, or would they shut it down and absorb the users into their existing products? Had I thought about the responsibility I had to students who depended on my app for homework help? The question caught me off guard, because I had been thinking about acquisition offers purely in terms of money and what I could do with it. I had not really considered what would happen to the 3,000 students using my service every week. Vikram said that was exactly the kind of thinking that separated entrepreneurs who built lasting companies from people who just wanted a quick exit. He told me about a founder he had invested in years ago who turned down a big acquisition offer because he felt responsible to his users and wanted to keep building something that actually helped people. That company eventually became worth way more than the initial offer, and the founder never regretted his decision. By the end of our conversation, I realized I had not thought nearly enough about the ethical implications of my decisions. Vikram said he was interested in investing, but wanted to see me develop a clearer vision for what I was building beyond just growing revenue numbers. Friday evening, Tiana texted, asking if I wanted to meet at the library to discuss the compliance requirements Foster had given me. She said she had invited a few other students who used my app regularly, so we could get their input on the parental consent system I needed to build. I showed up around 6 and found Tiana at a study table with 3 other students I recognized from the school. She introduced them and explained they were all active users who had agreed to give me honest feedback. I pulled up my laptop and showed them the mock-up I had started designing for a parental consent flow. Parents would get an email explaining what data the app collected and asking them to approve their student's account. The students immediately pointed out problems with my design. One girl said her parents barely checked email and would probably never see the consent request. Another student said his parents did not speak English well and would be confused by the technical language in my draft policy. A third student said the whole process seemed annoying and would probably make some kids just not use the app rather than deal with getting their parents involved. I asked how they would make it better, and they started brainstorming ideas. Make the consent process work on phones, since parents were more likely to see and respond to a text message than an email. Write the privacy policy in simple language that anyone could understand, not legal terms. Maybe offer an in-person consent option at the school for parents who wanted to ask questions. They gave me brutally honest feedback about how the requirements would affect real users, but also acknowledged the privacy protection made sense. One student pointed out that her parents would actually feel better about her using the app if they knew it had been reviewed for safety. By the end of the hour, I had pages of notes about how to make compliance less painful for users. Tiana walked out with me afterward and said she was impressed I was taking the feedback seriously instead of just building what was easiest for me. The following Monday, during passing period between second and third period, Mrs. Duran stopped me in the hallway outside her classroom. She said I needed to report to the AP biology lab after school to clean up after their dissection lab as additional punishment for attitude problems. I started to ask what attitude problems she meant, but she cut me off saying she did not have time to argue about it. Several students in the hallway had stopped to listen, and I felt my face getting hot with embarrassment. Before I could respond, Mr. Castillo appeared from around the corner pushing his cleaning cart. He had clearly overheard the conversation. He stopped next to us and spoke politely but firmly. He pointed out that assigning cross-departmental punitive labor was not covered under school policy and could be considered retaliation given my ongoing grade remediation process. Mrs. Duran's expression shifted from smug to uncertain. She said she was just trying to teach me about responsibility and following instructions. Mr. Castillo said that was fine, but it needed to happen within her own classroom and subject area, not by assigning me to clean up after other teachers' labs. He suggested if she had concerns about my attitude, she should document them properly and discuss them with administration, rather than creating unofficial punishments. Mrs. Duran looked between us for a moment, then said she would think about it, and walked back into her classroom. But before she left, she shot me a look that made it clear she was not done finding ways to make my life difficult. The hallway had gone quiet with students watching the whole exchange. Mr. Castillo gave me a small nod and continued pushing his cart down the hall like nothing had happened. I stood there for a moment feeling grateful, but also worried about what Mrs. Duran would try next. Tuesday afternoon, I got an email from someone named Rachel Chen, who ran a local education blog. She said she heard through the grapevine about a high school student running a successful tutoring platform and wanted to interview me about student entrepreneurship. I stared at the email for a few minutes trying to figure out who had been talking about me. The attention felt good in a way, but also made my stomach tight with worry. I had no idea if publicity would help my situation or make everything worse with Mrs. Duran and the school. I forwarded the email to Vikram with a quick message asking what he thought. His response came back within an hour, saying I should hold off on any press until after the compliance issues were completely resolved and my academic situation was stable. He said media attention could complicate things with the district and with Mrs. Duran if she felt like I was trying to embarrass her publicly. I wrote back to Rachel saying I appreciated the interest but needed to focus on the school right now. Wednesday morning, Joyce Hendricks stopped me in the hallway before first period. She told me she had arranged for another AP chemistry teacher to observe Mrs. Duran's class as part of a routine peer review process. Her face stayed completely neutral when she said it, but the timing was obvious. I felt this weird mix of feelings. Part of me was glad someone was finally checking on how Mrs. Duran taught and graded, but another part felt guilty because I never meant to get her in trouble with administration. I just wanted fair treatment for myself. The situation kept getting bigger and more complicated than I intended. I thanked Joyce and headed to class, trying not to think about how Mrs. Duran would react when she found out about the observation. Over the weekend, I finally finished implementing the new parental consent flow on my app. I pushed the update live Saturday morning and then sat at my desk watching the analytics dashboard. My conversion rate started dropping almost immediately. Users who would have signed up before were now hitting the parental consent requirement and bouncing. By Sunday evening, the numbers showed a 30% drop in new signups. I did the math in my head and realized I was losing roughly $12,000 in monthly recurring revenue by doing the right thing. Watching those revenue numbers decline in real time felt physically painful. My chest got tight, and I kept refreshing the dashboard, hoping the trend would reverse. But Foster's deadline was firm, and the alternative was losing school network access entirely, which would kill way more than 30% of my business. I closed my laptop and tried to focus on the long-term play instead of panicking about short-term losses. Monday morning, I opened my email and found a message from a company called EduTech Solutions, offering $1.2 million to acquire my app outright. The number was way higher than the previous offers I had gotten. For a few minutes, I just stared at it, thinking about how that much money would solve every problem I currently had. No more compliance stress, no more server costs, no more late nights fixing bugs. I could focus entirely on the school and college applications, but I forwarded it to Vikram before responding because I had learned not to make big decisions without advice. He called me that evening while I was doing homework. He said I definitely should not sell right now. The offer was too low given my revenue trajectory and growth rate. If I could solve the compliance issues, I would have much better options in 6 months. He also mentioned the possibility of raising a small angel round instead, which would give me capital to hire help without giving up control of the company. The call made me feel better about not taking the easy money. Tuesday afternoon, I showed up to Mrs. Duran's classroom after school for the second part of my assessment, the timed written test using her exact format. Joyce Hendricks was there again with her notebook ready to observe. Mrs. Duran handed me the test packet and set a timer for 45 minutes. I forced myself to show every single redundant step, even when it felt unnecessary. I labeled everything precisely the way she had demonstrated in class. I double-checked that my notation matched her examples from the board. The problems themselves were straightforward equilibrium equations that I could solve in my sleep. I finished with 20 minutes left on the timer, but I used the extra time to review my work obsessively. I went through each problem 3 times, checking for any excuse she might use to mark me down. When the timer went off, I handed in my test and walked out, feeling confident I had followed her system perfectly, even if it felt inefficient and wasteful. Wednesday after school, Joyce Hendricks called me back to her office. She proposed an additional component to my grade remediation. She wanted me to go back through my previous failed tests and annotate my work to show the connection between my methods and the standard textbook approaches. She explained this would demonstrate retroactive understanding and provide documentation for changing my grades from F to passing marks. It meant more work on top of everything else I was juggling, but it was also a clear path to actually fixing my GPA. I agreed to complete the annotations within 2 weeks. I spent the next several evenings after school sitting in the library with my old chemistry tests spread out on the table. I wrote detailed annotations explaining each step of my problem-solving process and how it related to the methods in the textbook. The work was tedious and sometimes made me angry. I had to justify approaches that I knew were correct, but that Mrs. Duran had marked wrong. I had to explain why my shortcuts worked and show that I understood the longer standard methods too. By the end of the week, my hand was cramping from writing so much, and I had fallen behind on my regular schoolwork. But I kept pushing through because fixing my chemistry grade was worth the short-term pain. Thursday afternoon, I was in the middle of dinner when my phone started buzzing with notification after notification. I checked my email and found angry messages flooding my support inbox. My app had experienced a billing bug that accidentally charged some users twice for their monthly subscription. I felt my stomach drop as I read through the complaints. I spent the entire evening processing refunds manually and sending personal apology messages to every single affected user. Around 9 p.m., I texted Tiana asking if she could help me draft a transparent explanation to post on the app's status page. She came over, and we worked together to write something honest about what went wrong and how I was fixing it. We turned what could have been a total disaster into an opportunity to show users I took their trust seriously. The incident cost me about $3,000 in refunds, but it probably saved my reputation. Friday morning, I opened my email and found a message from Foster McPherson. The district's legal counsel had reviewed my updated privacy policy and consent flow, but they were requiring an external security audit before they would approve continued school network access. He recommended a specific auditing firm that specialized in EdTech compliance. I clicked the link and found their quote, $8,500. I sat there staring at the number, feeling stress build up in my chest. Most of my revenue went right back into server costs and development work. I did not have that kind of money just sitting around. I would have to either take on debt or sell equity way earlier than I wanted. The compliance requirements kept getting more expensive and complicated. That evening my phone rang and Vikram's name showed up on the screen. He said he had been thinking about my situation and wanted to offer to fund the security audit. In exchange, he would give me a small convertible note, basically a loan that would convert to equity later if I raised a proper funding round. He explained the terms were founder-friendly and the interest rate was reasonable, but it meant I would be taking on my first real investor obligation with actual legal documents and responsibilities. I told him I needed to talk to my parents first. We all sat at the kitchen table that night while I explained what a convertible note was and what Vikram was offering. My parents were overwhelmed by the business terminology, but they were trying their best to understand. They asked good questions about what would happen if I could not pay back the loan and what percentage of my company Vikram might end up with. After an hour of discussion, we all agreed that solving the compliance problem was worth more than maintaining complete ownership of a business that might get blocked from schools. I called Vikram back and accepted his offer. That Saturday morning, I opened my laptop and pulled up the security firm's scheduling portal. Their earliest available slot was the following Thursday, which meant I had less than a week to prepare all the documentation they needed. I started making a list of everything they requested: system architecture diagrams, data flowcharts, privacy policy documentation, server configuration details, user authentication protocols. The list kept growing, and I realized how much of this stuff I'd been handling informally in my head instead of writing it down properly. I spent 6 hours that day just documenting how my database was structured and what information I collected from users. Every table, every field, every relationship between different pieces of data. My parents brought me lunch at my desk because I forgot to eat. By evening, I had a 20-page document that looked almost professional, like something a real company would have instead of a high school side project. Sunday, I worked on the security measures documentation, how I encrypted passwords, how I handled payment information, what logs I kept, and how long I stored them. The auditors wanted to see my incident response plan, which didn't exist, so I had to create one from scratch. What would I do if someone hacked the database? How would I notify affected users? What backup systems did I have in place? Writing it all out made me realize how much I'd been winging it, trusting that nothing bad would happen instead of preparing for when it did. I finished the documentation package Sunday night and emailed it to the security firm, then collapsed into bed feeling like I'd just completed a full semester project in 2 days. Monday morning, I walked into school and found an email from Joyce Hendricks asking me to come to her office during my free period. The subject line said, "Formal complaint review," and my stomach dropped. I knew what this was about before I even opened the message. Mrs. Duran had filed an official complaint claiming I'd been disrespectful and insubordinate. The email attached a copy of her written statement describing how I'd refused to complete assigned cleaning duties and how Mr. Castillo had interfered with her classroom management. She made it sound like I was some problem student who challenged authority instead of someone who'd been unfairly punished. I sat through first and second period barely paying attention, my mind spinning through how to respond. During my free period, I went to Joyce's office, and she had me sit down with a serious expression. She explained that any formal complaint required a full inquiry with documentation and witness statements. I would need to provide my version of events in writing. Mr. Castillo would be interviewed as a witness. The whole process could take 2 weeks to resolve. I felt anger rising in my chest, because this was so obviously retaliation for me standing up for myself, but Joyce's calm professionalism kept me from exploding. After the meeting, I found Mr. Castillo in the maintenance office and told him what happened. He shook his head and said he'd expected this. He reminded me that I'd been documenting everything properly while Mrs. Duran had been acting on emotion, and that would matter when Joyce reviewed all the evidence. He told me to stay calm and let the process work, not to give Mrs. Duran any real ammunition by actually being disrespectful now. I wrote my statement during lunch, carefully describing each incident and attaching the dates and details I'd been keeping in my phone notes. Tuesday, I sat in the cafeteria picking at my food and seriously considered just dropping AP chemistry entirely. The stress was becoming too much. Between running the app, dealing with compliance issues, fighting for fair grades, and now defending myself against formal complaints, something had to give. Maybe it made more sense to take regular chemistry instead and free up mental energy for everything else. I could still get into a good college with regular chemistry on my transcript. I pulled up the course change form on my phone and started filling it out. Mr. Castillo found me in the chemistry lab after lunch where I'd gone to think. He asked what I was doing, and I showed him the partially completed course change form. He sat down on one of the lab stools and looked at me seriously. He said, "Dropping now would feel like letting Mrs. Duran win, like proving she was right that I didn't belong in advanced classes." He pointed out that colleges would see a gap in my transcript where I dropped from AP to regular mid-year, and they'd wonder why. More importantly, he said I'd already done the hard work of standing up for myself through proper channels. I'd filed complaints, completed demonstration assessments, documented everything carefully. Quitting before seeing the results would waste all that effort. He reminded me that I was smart enough to handle the material, and I'd proven that through the assessments. The only question was whether I had the determination to see it through. His words hit me harder than I expected. I closed the course change form without submitting it and told him I'd stick it out. He smiled and said he knew I would. Wednesday afternoon, I walked into the student ethics panel, feeling like I was on trial. 5 students and 2 teachers sat behind a long table in the library conference room. They'd been reviewing whether my tutoring app constituted academic dishonesty or gave users an unfair advantage. I sat down in the chair facing them, and the panel chair explained they'd reviewed my app and wanted to hear my perspective. I started by explaining that the app was basically the same as hiring a private tutor, just more affordable and accessible. Students who could pay for expensive test prep services or private tutors had been getting extra help forever. My app just made that same kind of support available to more people. One panel member asked how I prevented the app from being used to cheat on homework or share test answers. I pulled up the app on my laptop and showed them the safeguards I'd built. Tutors couldn't access students' actual assignments. The platform was designed for explanation and teaching, not for providing answers. All sessions were logged, and I could review them if teachers reported concerns about specific users. Another panel member asked about the peer tutoring model and whether students were qualified to teach each other. I explained the matching algorithm that connected students based on learning styles and the rating system that helped identify effective tutors. Users could see tutor ratings and feedback before booking sessions. A teacher on the panel asked about my revenue model and whether I was profiting from academic support that should be free. I admitted I charged for the service, but pointed out that my prices were way lower than traditional tutoring, and I needed to cover server costs and pay the peer tutors. The hearing lasted an hour, with detailed questions about every aspect of how the app worked. Walking out, I felt like I'd articulated my position clearly, but I had no idea which way the panel would decide. Thursday morning, the security auditors showed up as scheduled. 2 people with laptops who spent the entire day reviewing my code line by line. They accessed my servers remotely and examined how I stored user data. They tested my authentication system and tried to find vulnerabilities. I sat in class checking my phone between periods, seeing notifications about their access requests and test activities. After school, I logged in to see their preliminary findings. They'd identified several areas where my logging could be stronger. My password encryption was good, but they recommended additional salting. Some of my API endpoints didn't have proper rate limiting, which could allow denial of service attacks. My session management needed improvement. Nothing was critically dangerous, but there were definitely weak spots that could be exploited by someone determined enough. I spent Thursday evening implementing their recommended fixes, adding better logging to track who accessed what data and when, implementing rate limiting on all my API endpoints, strengthening my session token generation. Friday after school, I continued working on the security improvements. The auditors had recommended using a key management service instead of storing encryption keys directly in my code. I spent 3 hours migrating to a proper key management system, learning way more about cryptography than I ever expected to know. By Friday night, I'd addressed every item on their preliminary findings list. I sent them an email with a detailed summary of what I'd fixed and how. They responded saying they were impressed with how quickly I'd implemented their recommendations and that their final report would reflect that. They said they'd seen professional development teams take weeks to address similar findings. The following Monday, I showed up for the third and final part of my demonstration assessment. This was the lab practical, where I had to solve equilibrium problems using Mrs. Duran's methods while explaining my reasoning out loud. Joyce Hendricks sat in the back of the classroom with her notebook. Mrs. Duran stood at the front, looking tense. She handed me a worksheet with 5 equilibrium problems and pointed to the lab bench where I'd be working. I started with the first problem, writing out every step using exactly the format she'd demonstrated in class. I explained each step as I worked, describing why I was applying Le Chatelier's principle and how I was calculating the equilibrium constant. Mrs. Duran watched closely, but didn't interrupt. I moved through the second and third problems, showing all my work in her preferred notation, labeling everything precisely, using her exact terminology. Joyce took notes, but her expression stayed neutral. The fourth problem was trickier, involving a multi-step equilibrium, but I worked through it methodically. Explained how I was tracking each species through the reaction sequence, showed how the equilibrium expressions connected. The fifth problem required using an ICE table, which I set up exactly as Mrs. Duran had taught. I filled in the initial concentrations, showed the changes, calculated the equilibrium values. I finished after about 40 minutes and looked up. Mrs. Duran reviewed my work without saying anything, just marking things on her copy of the worksheet. Joyce asked me a few clarifying questions about my reasoning for problem 4. I answered confidently, explaining the logic behind each decision. Walking out, I felt like I'd finally cleared the bar Mrs. Duran had set. Whether she wanted to admit it or not, I'd proven I could adapt to her system when required, even if it wasn't my natural approach. Tuesday afternoon, Joyce called me to her office again. This time, her expression was less serious, almost satisfied. She said the administration had decided to require all AP science teachers to participate in professional development about differentiated assessment methods and multiple solution pathways. She didn't explicitly say this resulted from my complaint, but the implication was obvious. The school recognized that rigid adherence to one methodology wasn't appropriate for advanced students. She also mentioned that the peer observation of Mrs. Duran's class had revealed some concerns about her grading consistency that went beyond just my situation. Other students had similar complaints about correct work being marked wrong due to methodology differences. The professional development would address how to create rubrics that specified required elements versus stylistic preferences, how to accept multiple valid approaches to the same problem, how to assess understanding rather than just compliance. Joyce said the training would happen over winter break, so it wouldn't disrupt current classes. I felt a strange mix of vindication and guilt. I'd wanted fairness for myself, but I hadn't necessarily intended to get Mrs. Duran in trouble with administration. At the same time, if other students were experiencing the same issues, maybe this needed to happen. Wednesday evening, my phone buzzed with an email from Vikram. The subject line said, "Term sheet draft," and I opened it immediately. The document was surprisingly straightforward for legal paperwork. $15,000 at 5% interest. The loan would convert to equity at a 20% discount if I raised a Series A funding round within 2 years. There was a valuation cap that protected me from excessive dilution if the company ended up being worth way more than expected. I read through it twice, then called my parents into my room. We sat together at my desk going through each section. My dad asked questions about what would happen if I couldn't pay back the loan. Vikram had included a clause saying if I didn't raise a Series A, I could just pay back the $15,000 plus interest over 3 years. My mom wanted to understand the equity conversion mechanics. I explained that basically, if I raised serious investor money later, Vikram would get to convert his loan into ownership shares at a discount, rewarding him for taking the early risk. We discussed it for an hour, my parents clearly overwhelmed by the business terminology, but trying their best to understand. By the end, they agreed the terms seemed fair, given my current situation. Taking on $15,000 in debt was serious, but solving the compliance problem and having operating capital was worth it. I signed the documents that night using an electronic signature tool Vikram had sent. Seeing my name on official investment paperwork felt surreal. This wasn't just a side project anymore. This was real financial responsibility with legal obligations. Thursday morning, I woke up to an email from Foster McPherson. The subject line made my heart race. Security audit results and network access approval. I opened it immediately. The security audit had passed with only minor recommendations, all of which I'd already addressed. The district's legal counsel had reviewed the updated privacy policy and consent flow. They were approving continued school network access for my app. The relief was so intense, I actually felt dizzy. I'd been genuinely worried about losing a huge chunk of my user base and the credibility hit that would come with being blocked from schools. I immediately logged into my app's admin panel and updated the status page. I wrote a message thanking users for their patience during the compliance review and explaining the new privacy protections we'd implemented. Then I texted Tiana, asking if she could help me draft a more detailed explanation for users. She came over after school, and we worked together on the message. She suggested framing it as a positive upgrade, rather than just compliance requirements. We emphasized how the security improvements made everyone's data safer, how the parental consent process gave families more control, how the external audit verified that the app met professional standards. We posted the update Thursday evening and immediately got positive responses from users who appreciated the transparency. Friday afternoon, Joyce called me to her office one more time. I walked in nervous about what new issue had come up, but her expression was different this time, almost pleased. She said my grade remediation had been approved based on my demonstration assessments and annotated test work. My chemistry grade would be changed from F to C+, with the possibility of raising it to B- if I maintained strong performance on upcoming assignments. It wasn't the A I probably deserved originally, but it was passing, and it reflected actual understanding rather than methodology compliance. Joyce explained that the grade change would be processed through the system over the weekend and would appear on my transcript by Monday. She also mentioned that Mrs. Duran's formal complaint had been dismissed after reviewing all the documentation and witness statements. The inquiry had found that my behavior was appropriate and that Mr. Castillo's intervention was justified. I felt a complex mix of relief and satisfaction and residual frustration. Relief that my grade was fixed and I wouldn't fail the class. Satisfaction that the system had ultimately worked, even though it took way too much effort. But also frustration that I'd had to fight so hard for basic fairness, that I'd spent weeks documenting and appealing and defending myself just to get credit for work I'd done correctly in the first place. Walking out of Joyce's office, I felt exhausted but also proud. I'd stood up for myself through proper channels, and it had actually worked. The following Monday, Joyce called me to her office for what she described as a restorative meeting with Mrs. Duran and Mr. Castillo. I walked in to find them already sitting at the small conference table, Mrs. Duran staring at her hands while Mr. Castillo gave me an encouraging nod. Joyce started by explaining we were here to discuss what happened and find a path forward. not to assign blame or punish anyone. The atmosphere felt thick and uncomfortable, like nobody wanted to be there. Joyce asked me to share how the situation had affected me, so I explained how being called out in front of the whole class made me feel stupid and unwelcome in advanced science. How getting failed repeatedly on correct work made me doubt my abilities, even though I knew the material. How the public suggestions to drop down to regular classes or shop made other students think I was failing because I couldn't handle AP-level work. Mr. Castillo spoke next about how he'd watched me working in the lab and recognized genuine understanding that wasn't being acknowledged. He talked about how punitive approaches push talented students away from STEM fields entirely, especially when they learn differently than the standard path. Mrs. Duran sat quietly through most of this, occasionally defending her intentions by saying she was trying to prepare students for college rigor and AP exam expectations. But she didn't really defend her execution, or the way she'd treated me specifically. During a pause in the conversation, Mrs. Duran started talking about the pressure she faced from administration regarding AP exam pass rates. She mentioned dealing with multiple cheating scandals in previous years, where students had shared answers or used unauthorized resources, which made her overly strict about showing work to prove individual understanding. She admitted she'd started seeing any different approach as a potential shortcut rather than genuine problem-solving. Her voice got quieter as she explained how her frustration with past students who actually did cheat had affected how she treated me, even though I wasn't cheating. The explanation didn't make what she did okay, but it helped me understand she wasn't just being cruel for no reason. She was dealing with her own professional stress and responding badly to it. Joyce guided the conversation toward solutions, asking what would help us move forward productively. We spent another 30 minutes working through specifics until we reached an agreement. Mrs. Duran would accept multiple solution methods in her class as long as students could explain their reasoning clearly, and she'd work with the other AP science teachers to develop clearer rubrics that spelled out what was actually required versus what was just her preference. I agreed to show my work more completely going forward and to talk to her directly if I felt grading was unfair before taking it to administration. It wasn't perfect, and the relationship still felt strained, but it seemed like real progress toward something functional. Tuesday afternoon, I was sitting in the library working on app updates when my phone buzzed with a notification about the Education Blogger's article. She'd published a piece about student entrepreneurship and the challenges of running a business while in high school, keeping me anonymous, but covering the compliance issues and the tension between innovation and school rules. The article asked whether schools should support or restrict student business ventures, presenting both perspectives fairly. I read through it twice, feeling relieved she hadn't turned it into some dramatic exposé about my specific situation with Mrs. Duran. By evening, the article had generated some discussion in local education circles based on the comments section, but nothing close to the media circus I'd worried about. Several teachers actually stopped me in the hallway over the next few days to say they'd read it and found it thought-provoking. Wednesday evening, I sat at my desk finalizing the paperwork for Vikram's convertible note, reading through the terms one more time before signing electronically. The next morning, I checked my business bank account and saw the $15,000 had transferred overnight. I immediately logged into my accounting software and paid the security auditing firm their full invoice of $8,500. Then I set aside $3,000 for the next quarter's server costs and allocated $2,000 for hiring part-time customer support help to handle the growing volume of user questions. Having real investor capital felt different from just collecting revenue from users. There was an added weight of responsibility to use the money wisely and show actual results that justified Vikram's confidence in me. I created a detailed budget spreadsheet breaking down every category of spending and shared it with Vikram during our weekly video check-in that evening. Thursday after school, I met Tiana in the library, along with 2 other students who used my app regularly. We sat at a corner table, and I explained my idea for formalizing a student advisory board that could provide ongoing feedback about features and help shape the product direction. Tiana immediately volunteered to coordinate the group and said she could recruit other users from different grade levels and subject areas to make sure we heard diverse perspectives. One of the other students suggested we create a private Discord server where board members could discuss issues and vote on feature priorities. The conversation energized me in a way that looking at revenue dashboards never did. Building something that actually helped people felt more meaningful than just watching numbers go up. We spent an hour brainstorming how the advisory board would work and what kinds of input would be most valuable. Friday morning during announcements, the principal's voice came over the intercom, recognizing several staff members for going above and beyond. When she mentioned Mr. Castillo receiving a commendation for mentoring students and supporting their academic success, I looked across the cafeteria during lunch and caught his eye. I mouthed, "Thank you," and he just nodded with a small smile, looking genuinely pleased, but not making a big deal of the recognition. His quiet support throughout this whole mess had made all the difference between me giving up and actually fighting for fairness. The following week in AP Chemistry, I noticed Mrs. Duran's behavior toward me had shifted to something more neutral and professional. She wasn't warm or encouraging, but she also wasn't singling me out for criticism or piling on extra punishment. When I raised my hand to ask a question about equilibrium constants, she answered it directly and clearly, without any sarcasm or dismissive comments. When I turned in my lab report, she graded it based on the actual content and scientific reasoning, rather than looking for methodology excuses to mark me down. The relationship wasn't friendly, and probably never would be, but it was finally functional enough that I could learn without constant stress. Over the next few weeks, my chemistry performance stabilized with consistent grades in the B+ range on quizzes and tests. I wasn't acing everything, but I was demonstrating solid understanding of the material, and more importantly, I was learning it in ways that would actually help me when the AP exam came around in May. My confidence in science classes slowly rebuilt as I realized I could succeed when the playing field was level and the grading was fair. The whole experience taught me that sometimes you have to fight for basic fairness, even when it's exhausting and stressful. But it also showed me I was capable of handling that fight and coming out okay on the other side. By mid-November, Foster sent a final clearance email confirming my app met all district compliance requirements and would continue to have school network access with quarterly monitoring reviews going forward. The ongoing oversight felt reasonable rather than threatening, since it was clear Foster wanted to support student innovation while protecting privacy, not shut things down just because they were new or different. My user growth resumed its upward trajectory over the following weeks, though, with slightly thinner profit margins due to the compliance costs I'd added. The parental consent flow and security measures reduced my monthly revenue by about $12,000, but I accepted that as the price of running a legitimate operation that respected user privacy and followed the rules. When December finals rolled around, I walked into the AP chemistry exam room with my calculator and pencil case, feeling more prepared than I'd felt all semester. The exam covered everything from stoichiometry to equilibrium constants, and I worked through each problem methodically, showing my steps clearly but not obsessively. Some questions I solved using Mrs. Duran's preferred methods, and others I approached differently when it made more sense, confident that the AP graders would accept multiple valid solution paths. 3 hours later, I handed in my test booklet and left the room exhausted, but satisfied that I'd demonstrated actual understanding of the material. 2 weeks later, when final grades posted, I logged into the student portal and saw a B in AP chemistry for the fall semester. Not the A I might have earned if the grading had been fair from the start, but a solid passing grade that proved I belonged in advanced science and kept my college applications on track. My overall GPA dropped slightly from the earlier failed tests, but sitting there staring at that B, I felt something bigger than grade point disappointment. I'd stayed in the class when everyone, including Mrs. Duran, expected me to quit, and I'd proven to myself that I could handle unfair treatment without giving up on what mattered. During winter break, I finally used some of Vikram's investment money to hire actual help instead of trying to do everything myself. I posted job listings for a part-time customer support person and a part-time developer, and within a week, I'd interviewed 5 candidates and hired 2 college students who'd both built similar projects. The support person was a sophomore at the state university who'd worked customer service at a tech startup, and the developer was a junior computer science major who'd created her own tutoring marketplace app that never quite took off. Both of them were excited to work on something that actually helped people instead of just another generic social media clone, and they started immediately handling the daily operational work that had been eating up my evenings and weekends. Having real team members meant I could finally sleep more than 5 hours a night for the first time in months. I'd been running on caffeine and stress for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to wake up actually rested, instead of dragging myself out of bed to handle support tickets before school. In early January, Joyce Hendricks sent an email to the entire school about new grading guidance for advanced courses. The message emphasized that teachers should accept multiple valid solution methods and provide clear rubrics that distinguished between required elements and stylistic preferences. She didn't mention my situation specifically, but the timing was obvious, and over the next few days, 3 different students approached me privately, to say thank you for pushing back against unfair grading because they'd experienced similar issues in other AP classes. One girl told me her calculus teacher had been marking her down for using techniques from online videos instead of the textbook method, and another guy said his physics teacher refused to accept any work that didn't match her exact notation system. The policy change wouldn't help me retroactively with my damaged GPA, but knowing it might prevent other students from facing the same treatment made the whole exhausting ordeal feel worthwhile. One afternoon in mid-January, I stayed after school to help Mr. Castillo reorganize the chemistry lab storage room, moving boxes of old equipment and sorting through expired chemicals that needed proper disposal. We worked in comfortable silence for a while before he started telling me more about his Silicon Valley days. How he'd joined a payments startup in the early 2000s as employee number 12 and watched it grow to 300 people before getting acquired. How he'd moved to another company and then another, always chasing the next big exit and the next round of funding. How his wife's cancer diagnosis had forced them to relocate here for treatment at the university hospital, and how he'd taken the custodial job because it had good insurance and flexible hours for medical appointments. But the surprising part was when he explained that after 10 years of startup chaos, he'd actually found the custodial work more satisfying. He could see the direct impact of his efforts every day, could help students like me without the politics and pressure of chasing investor metrics. I thanked him for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself, for seeing past the failed test grades to recognize what I'd actually built. He just shrugged and said he saw someone being treated unfairly and decided to do something about it, like that was the most natural thing in the world. Our friendship had become one of the unexpected gifts from this whole mess, proof that sometimes the most important support comes from the places you least expect. That evening I sat at my desk working on a new feature for my app when a support ticket came through from a student I'd never interacted with before. The message explained how they'd been failing calculus all semester, completely lost and ready to give up, until they found my app and got matched with a tutor who finally explained derivatives in a way that made sense. They'd just passed their final exam with a C+, and wanted to thank me for creating something that literally saved their grade and kept them from having to retake the class. I wrote back with encouragement about how proud I was of their hard work and persistence, then leaned back in my chair looking at my metrics dashboard. The numbers showed 3,400 users now, and steady growth, monthly revenue holding stable, even with the compliance costs eating into margins. My chemistry textbook sat open on my desk next to my laptop, homework problems for tomorrow already half finished. The balance still wasn't perfect and probably never would be. I was managing both school and business without sacrificing either, juggling AP classes and investor calls and product development and college applications. Mrs. Duran and I maintained our professional distance in chemistry class, neither friendly nor hostile, just two people coexisting in the same space. My grades were solid across all my classes. Vikram checked in weekly with advice and investor connections, and I was building something that actually mattered to real students, facing real struggles. Life was complicated and messy with too many demands and not enough hours, but it was also pretty good. I was learning to be okay with that. Well, that's the big finish, if you can call it that. If you're still here, you've either got a lot of patience or no self-control. Either way, I'm not judging. Go on, subscribe and embrace the chaos with me.